Hello, I'm Eric Topol for Medicine and the Machine, and with my friend and co-host Abraham Verghese. This is actually the last podcast of Medicine and the Machine. So for that 5-year run, we're especially grateful to all of our listeners and to our guest today, Dr. Gavin Francis, who is a prolific author as well as a physician in Scotland. Welcome, Gavin.
Oh, thank you very much for having me on the podcast.
Yeah, welcome, Gavin. It's been a while since I've seen you. And as Eric was saying, you've had an extraordinary career as an explorer, a traveler, a writer, a general practitioner, someone at the front of the COVID response in your community. So we're really delighted to have you on. It's a very fitting last show, I think, for us, Eric, don't you think, to talk about issues like this?
No, absolutely. Gavin, you've really been a prolific writer, but also a keen observer. I wonder if that's because you travel all around the world and you're particularly astute. But your last book, well, I know you have one in the hopper about the NHS, Free for All, but the one that we at least know about that have our hands on, Recovery, The Lost Art of Convalescence, a pithy book full of wisdom. Maybe you can tell us a bit about it.
Yeah, of course. So thanks, Eric. Thanks, Abraham. So I am a general practitioner in Scotland, and I work in the city of Edinburgh and also rurally in the Highlands of Scotland. I'm part of my time, and I had not long finished writing an account of primary care responses to COVID in the UK. And in 2021 into 2022, I realized that as a primary care physician, I was spending more and more of my time talking to patients about recovery from COVID itself, of course, because most people with COVID never go near hospital. They stay in their own homes, but also recovery from the damaging mental health effects of the lockdowns. And I realized that I was having the same conversations again and again about principles of convalescence that I take for granted, but that many of my patients did not. And so I decided to distill all these conversations and reflections and observations and wisdom of my own mentors over the years into this one short, accessible book. So that's the origin story for the book.
Yeah, I found it really quite delightful because I think, at least in America, we're focused on acute illness, or else we're focused on rehabilitation, but not in the sense that you mean it. I think it's much more about physical rehabilitation and nothing in between. And I wonder, is this something of a unique British sensibility, the idea of convalescence and the receptivity towards such a notion?
I hope it's not uniquely British. I mean, I was trained very much in the Western tradition, very biomedical model of illness. And as in the United States, most physicians' training takes place in hospitals. And you all know that for the majority of patients, as soon as they can walk back and forth to the toilet and dress themselves, they're often discharged from hospital. And it's only once they're back at home that the journey of recovery really begins. And it's a journey that can take many months from all kinds of conditions, and that general practitioners are much more closely involved in. And so it wasn't really until I became a primary care physician out in the community that I realized what a big part of my job guiding people through recovery is. You know, the word doctor comes from a root meaning guide. And I often feel that I am a guide for my patients through these sort of stormy waters or through these sort of challenging landscapes of recovery. And I wanted to offer this book, I suppose, as a way of helping others guide that journey.
I see a common thread, Gavin, with you and Abraham, where you have the human bond. You cue into it in a special way that a lot of the wisdom that you impart in this book is about that, is about that sensitivity, the presence, you know, the things that Abraham has been working on for the last, many decades. I don't know if you would agree with that sense.
Well, I'd love to hear what Abraham thinks, but yeah, certainly I think that my own journey as a doctor has made me realize, first of all, what a wonderful job it is. It's a very rewarding job, very satisfying job. Can you ask for any other better occupation than to take scientific knowledge and use it dispense it in little doses every day to make people feel better? I mean, it's a wonderfully rewarding thing to spend your time doing. But also, as I've gone on in my career, I've realized more and more that different kinds of patients respond better to different kinds of doctors, and different kinds of situations respond to different kinds of doctors. And so I wanted to write a book which was very aware of that sensitivity. Some situations call for a very paternalistic, science-based approach. Some situations call for a much more collaborative, warm approach with an arm around the shoulder with your patients. And so my own sense is that the very best doctors, such as yourself and Abraham, the very best doctors do modify and adjust their consulting style according to what kind of patient they encounter. And it was lovely to write a book which dug down and explored that magic that happens between a doctor and a patient when the consultation is going well, the truly therapeutic encounter.
I just marveled at the book. It's just full of wonderful sort of background on the history of convalescence and lots of little pithy pearls to offer patients. So it was really a wonderful, quick and enlightening read. I wanted to pick up on one aspect of this, which I hadn't thought about till I read it in your book, and that is travel or pilgrimage as a form of recovery. I know many friends who've made pilgrimages, to the famous churches in Spain, that doing that famous trail. It was in part a physical effort, but it was also a kind of spiritual recovery exercise. And it's interesting to make that prescription to patients, take a journey, make a pilgrimage and find your soul. But I think as postmodern physicians, we're hesitant to say these kinds of things, but you've given me some courage, I must say.
Oh, that's good to hear, because if you go all the way back to the origins of the English language, to Chaucer and the Canterbury Tales, that is a pilgrimage, and some of the characters on the Canterbury pilgrimage frame it explicitly as a healing pilgrimage, and I think that before we had modern medicine, people would often make journeys to either shrines or to healing water wells, springs, and sometimes it must have been the journey that helped. It must have been the act of preparing yourself and girding yourself for what might have been a bit of an ordeal, but then placing yourself in a new set of contexts with new people, thinking about your illness in a very different way. And then we can't, of course, discount the tremendous power that we're only beginning to understand and tap of the power of the placebo. I can't think of a more powerful placebo than making a long and difficult journey to behold a magical object about which you've already heard many testimonials of cure. And so that may have been part of it too. I sometimes wish I could prescribe my patients a holiday or a pilgrimage. Maybe I should start trying.
Well, you mentioned COVID, Gavin, and Abraham and I, for the last 4 years, have been covering COVID pretty intensely. But of course, with recovery of people with long COVID, there isn't that much of it. And so I suspect some of your patients are suffering from long COVID. What do you do when the hopes are not particularly sanguine, when we don't have a treatment and we don't have much to offer these folks, and it's a really challenging situation?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm very aware that a lot of medicine we don't have good cures for. Modern medicine is very good at mitigating and palliating and softening and blunting the effects of disease. But many of our conditions hold disease in abeyance rather than really cure it. And I'm very aware as a general practitioner that a lot of my job is about that, about trying to, and also about trying to help patients purely by telling them what has helped others. So a condition like long COVID, which is so poorly understood at the moment, I'm not able to fall back on that biomedical reassurance of telling them exactly what's going on in terms of molecules and chemistry. But I can tell them, well, this is what the physiotherapists in the rehabilitation department say. This is what they have found is most helpful. I can tell them stories from other patients. I can tell them stories about recovery from other kinds of chronic fatigue or chronic breathlessness, because one of the principles of this book is that we gain when we think about medicine as more than just pharmaceuticals. We gain when we realize that for some people with chronic lung disease, joining a choir might be a really effective therapy, or that for some people with Parkinson's disease, joining a dance class might be effective therapy. And so if we broaden our awareness of what constitutes a therapy, we gain and we can explore whole other ranges of options for our patients. And rather than see ourselves sitting opposite the patient, shrugging and saying, sorry, we don't understand this condition, I've got nothing to give. Instead, coming round the desk, sitting beside the patient and saying, well, let's go on this journey together and I'll tell you what some other people have told me.
I was struck, this is related to COVID, but you quote the Indian poet Rabindranath Tagore, who says, in the rhythm of life, pauses there must be for renewal. And one thing that struck me about COVID was, especially in America, we've been on this treadmill, this rat race, many of us in professionals, where it was just work, show up every day, weekends, renew, and suddenly came this moment, an extended moment when people were at home for a long time and they began to rediscover their families, rediscover their purpose. And as a result, we are struggling to bring people back to the workforce in the way that they once came. Maybe we shouldn't expect it at all, because everybody has sort of decided that, that was a crazy kind of life and there's a better way to do this that's more holistic. So I'm very struck with what COVID did for many of us who never necessarily got COVID, but it made us reassess what we were doing. Would you agree with that, Eric?
Oh, absolutely. I think that we're still processing about having gone through this. I'm sure, Gavin, you have some ideas as well.
Yeah, and I've found that a lot of my patients really reconfigured their priorities during COVID and realized that they wanted to build a life with more time for their families, more time back home. Really, as a general practitioner, about a third of my workload in a normal day concerns mental health. But during the worst of the lockdowns, it became more like 2/3. And a huge number of people were struggling with panic attacks, with insomnia. People were becoming quite paranoid because of so much public messaging of danger outside. And there was a huge amount of negative mental health effects caused by the lockdowns. But in amongst that, I saw some real transformations of life too. People who had never stopped their whole lives and suddenly were taking time to, dig their garden, metaphorically and truly dig their garden. And adolescence is another good example. Some adolescents who find school very challenging, and suddenly when the schools closed, they really flourished. And so what I've tried to do with those conversations is encourage people to listen to that and act on it and try and build a life that builds more of what they found positive out of it. Most people work too much. Most people work too hard. Wouldn't it be better to drop the intensity of work, and you may well find that you can work for longer?
Speaking of working hard, you have written 9 books. 9 books, and you're not even 50 years old. So help us understand how you balance your life as a physician. Can you help us understand how you achieve balance in your life?
Yeah, of course. I mean, I really love practicing as a physician. I love my medical work. And I became a general practitioner in the community because I love the diversity of that work. I realized I was lucky enough to realize early on in medical school that I was more interested in people than I was in diseases. And so I was never going to find an organ or a disease that would satisfy me or that could sustain my interest over a 40-year career. That diversity that I see in the community clinic extends now where I divide my time between 3 weeks out of 4. I work in Edinburgh, and I work in a very deprived area of the city with a lot of immigrants who don't speak English and a lot of multiple deprivation. And 1 week out of 4, I work in a very remote part of the Scottish Highlands where the population is extremely thinly dispersed. I cover about 1,000 square miles, and the population is just 1,500 in that 1,000 square miles. And so I get to practice medicine up there, but I also have a lot of time to write. So I'm eminently interruptible when I'm on call up there. And that I find that rhythm really helps me. And the writing really helps me too. I don't know how it is for you, Abraham, for you, Eric, but for me, writing uses such a different part of my brain that to write is really to refresh myself. And so I can find that after a couple of days of spending a lot of time writing, I need to go to clinic, and a clinic refreshes me. And then I become quite exhausted by the demands of the other people. And then I find that a day's writing refreshes me. And so the two are kind of mutually refreshing.
I would completely agree with that, except I think our temporal frame is slightly different. It took me 14 years to write my last book, so I need to take some lessons. But I want to turn to something that struck me in the book. You talked about a personal experience where having a lot of headache and getting an MRI, and it indicated that you needed surgery, but then you had to wait months for the surgery, and so you were sort of forced into a convalescence on your own. And I know this is not the topic of our discussion, but I'm curious about the difficulties that you face in the NHS, and especially of late, we seem to hear from this end about increasing difficulties. And how does that translate to your own experience as a general practitioner? What is it you're seeing? What are the challenges?
So the challenges are mostly about accessing secondary care. The clinics where I work, I'm able to look after all my patients that only need primary care fairly well. But as you also know, the UK's NHS is an extremely cheap way of running a national health service. It runs less than 9% of GDP is what it costs. Whereas I think your figures in the US are double or even more than double that in terms of your GDP spend on health. So it's an extremely budget service. And the way that our politicians have managed it is by trying to prevent the amount of money going into increasing. So what's happened is the waiting lists to see the specialists have just got longer and longer. And so right now, at the end of 13 years of our current governmental administration, we're facing 2 years sometimes to see a specialist in clinic for some of the specialties. Vascular surgery, for example, routine colorectal surgery is taking a year. Dermatology can take up to 2 years to see a dermatologist. And so that is very frustrating as a general practitioner, because I can manage eczema, for example, or I can manage peripheral vascular disease up to a point. But when I come to refer my patient to a dermatologist or to a vascular surgeon, it's because I've reached the limit of what I'm able to do as a primary care physician, and now I need a specialist to take over. And then to find that specialist is going to take a year or so until they see the patient is very frustrating. So that's the main challenge that I see on the ground. But I should point out too that the job remains immensely rewarding, because most of my patients, I can manage them without having to involve secondary or tertiary care. Most of the problems I can manage fine myself. And so that's as satisfying as it's always been.
Has that change of the length of time for secondary care been more sudden in the last few years, or has this been a steady problem throughout?
It has lengthened since 2010, because there was a change in government in 2010, and the new government that came into power then saw the spiraling costs of the health service caused by the aging population and didn't want to keep increasing the funding to the NHS in the way that the prior administration had. So they choked off increases to funding. And so the funding hasn't kept pace with the demand on it. So much so that the CEO of NHS England in 2017, he said, it took him 7 years, I suppose, to say it, but he said then that the NHS is no longer funded adequately to meet the demands that are being placed on it. So that was 6 years before COVID, 6 years before now, 3 years before COVID. And then the huge stress of the pandemic actually flipped us into a new paradigm, I would say, where things were getting quite bad in 2020 after 10 years of this underfunding. But then COVID has flipped us into a new paradigm where they've just really suddenly lengthened quite dramatically since 2021. And now, of course, the junior doctors are out on strike in England because they haven't seen any, they've seen a drop in pay in real terms since 2010. And so when the doctors go on strike, that puts the waiting lists even longer. So the National Health Service in the UK is in a bit of a pickle right now. I would argue it's purely because it's always been a very cheap service in comparison to other developed countries, and it's been obliged to become even cheaper over the last 13 years, and the demand isn't really able to cope.
Gavin, has this driven more and more people to private medical care, and is there is that going to be a stimulus to to sort of put more of the cost burden onto the patient and seek private care for things to be expedient?
Yeah, definitely. And it depends on which part of the country you're in. So I've heard it said that in London, over 30% of healthcare is in the commercial sector anyway. Whereas in Scotland, where I live, it's traditionally been a very small part, and I think it's still less than 5%. But without a doubt, where I started my career, I qualified in 1999, I became a GP in 2005. So when I started my career, it was very rare that patients would go into the private or commercial sector for a procedure. And it was usually only the very wealthy ones who would. Now it's quite common. And anyone who has any savings will often do that, particularly for straightforward procedures like cataract surgery or a hip replacement. They'll just go into their savings and go straight for it. Not through insurance, just through paying outright through their savings.
Yeah. When I was asked to do the review of NHS for the technology, AI and genomics and digital for the workforce, it was just before the pandemic. And it was actually, the people I got to work with are really upbeat. And yes, there were things in the background as you described, Gavin, but interestingly, the NHS in the UK is a world leader in genomics and intends to be the world leader in AI. And so what's interesting is while underfunded the care of patients, whatever resources they have, they're still putting into, trying to find ways to not have the growth in the workforce, which is stressing the costs of healthcare. So it's kind of an interesting priorities that have set in the country to maintain their reputation and contributions. I suspect you have seen our Future Health enroll more than 1 million people. And, we have this All of Us program in the US, and it's taken 7 years to enroll 500,000, and our Future Health in the UK has enrolled over 1 million people in less than a year, and doing sequencing on everybody. So it's really interesting how to be a research dominant place, but not necessarily using some of those funds, just to deal with the day-to-day medical problems. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, when the NHS came in 1948, it was a kind of very idealistic, some would say kind of utopian post-war thinking. Famously, the Minister for Health who brought in the NHS in 1948, he was a former miner. And he said, I should say that this isn't a direct quote, this is a summary of his philosophy. He said, illness is not an indulgence for which people should be punished. It's a misfortune, the cost of which should be borne by the community. Which is a lovely kind of distillation of an idea that, illness is bad luck. And so if you're going to offer good health care only to wealthy people, that's even worse luck. So it was an idea of collectivizing healthcare and collectivizing bad luck. That philosophy of cradle to grave healthcare, that's how it was sold to the population. This service will look after you from cradle to grave, means that everyone in the UK pretty much is registered as a primary care physician. Everybody's registered as part of the same system, and we have the most extraordinary data as a consequence. So there's 67 million people in the UK, and so those 67 million people are all registered with the same healthcare system. So once we start talking about genomics or even, incredible work that's being done in the UK on diabetes management, because the data sets are absolutely extraordinarily vast for how to manage these things. And so I would hope that's one of the reasons why the UK has remained a world leader, is because it's one of the benefits of having a truly national health service that everybody has signed up for. And the sadness, I suppose, of the last few years is that people don't trust it as much because its funding hasn't kept pace with expectation, and that starts to shatter it down into different kinds of providers, which means that we don't have such a big uniform data set of everybody being part of the same system.
I want to mention the tradition of physician writers bringing about social change is actually quite impressive, beginning with The Citadel, the book by A.J. Cronin, fellow Scott. And many people credit that book with capturing the nation's attention and making the idea of the NHS palatable. It really took the country by storm. I won't say it caused the NHS, but it certainly sowed the seeds for people to be receptive to that idea. So with that, with that sentiment, I want to compliment you on, just managing to wed a wonderful, meaningful career as a physician with this ability to comment on medicine and aspects of medicine in such a beautiful way. It's really been our privilege to get to chat with you, and we're looking forward to many more books in the years to come.
I was going to say, Gavin, you're a unique force because you not only have written books about travel, and your travel, they're all kinds around the world, but also I don't think there's anyone else that's done this, written books about travel and all these books about medicine. I first got to know your work through Adventures in the Human Body. It was almost 2015 when you wrote that. It was an amazing book. But before we close, I just get a comment about something that is maybe a thread between your advocacy for patients in recovery and, of course, in other books, and for our physicians and clinicians listeners who are struggling. They're struggling because of burnout, and it seems as though you found a solution of the balance of writing, just as you mentioned about dance and other things that you recommend to patients, pilgrimages, if you will. Can you comment about that as we close, as to how to deal with, to anti-burnout, how to come up with things that will keep the mental health at a high level for a clinician?
Well, for me, the way I combat burnout is first of all by trying to keep my clinical workload manageable, because I realize that I'm a better doctor when I'm rested and refreshed. My patients get better faster, and I enjoy the job. So it's about managing my clinical workload. And then once my clinical workload is managed, finding plenty of the things that refresh me, building a team, because one of the great pleasures of healthcare is the teams they get to work in, the most extraordinary colleagues, wonderful people to work with. And that goes right, of course, all the way from the receptionists on the front door of the clinic right up to the professor. And when I think about how much I love this work, and I'm asked about burnout and preventing burnout, I just try and encourage all my colleagues to connect again with what they love most about medicine. It's a really amazing profession. It's a very ancient profession. People have been doing it for thousands of years, and they'll do it for thousands of years to come. And you get to do this wonderful thing of meet people, use all your scientific knowledge and training, and make them feel better. And so if you can connect to the joy of that exchange, that encounter, that engagement of using your skills and knowledge to make people feel better all day, then I think you'll enjoy your work and you'll be much less likely to burn out.
Well, beautiful.
Yeah, thank you, Gavin. This is such an apropos closing of Medicine on the Machine. I think what we've learned in the last 5 years, it's about the medicine and the human-human bond, and then the machine. And you exemplify that. So I think we're very lucky to have you in our closing podcast. And thank you so much for joining, and we'll be reading your work and following you for years to come.